You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. Liberian journalist Rodney Sieh was once sentenced to 5,000 years in jail for failing to pay $1.6 million in a libel case. In 2013, he was sued by a minister for reporting on government corruption. Sieh was released after 4 months in prison. Now he's written a book about Liberian President George Weah, an international football star who came to power in 2018. Sieh's book about the man he calls Africa's footballer president is an unofficial biography. It details the complexity of Weah's personality, politics, and presidency. Sieh sat down with me here in Washington recently to discuss the book. Rodney, what motivated you to write a book about a president who was famous even before he became president? I mean, what story did you hope to tell, and who did you speak to for insights about President George Weah?
So the process began in a way where I wanted to make sure that he was involved in the process, because I wanted this book, if I do it, I wanted it to be great. And so I contacted him. I sent him a text message on WhatsApp and said, I need to tell you a story. Are you open to it? And he said, oh, I'm not ready to tell my story. And so I didn't give up. And I was very precise about who I spoke to about this book. I didn't want to tell the story that was hearsay, I wanted people who I interviewed to be on the record. Some people agreed, but they wanted to be off the record. And I was reluctant because I'm a very controversial journalist. I've been to prison twice. And I wanted to make sure that when I tell the story, it's a story that will hit home to people. And everyone I interviewed for this book are people who wanted to talk about it. The current vice president, Winston Tubman, who was George ran as a running mate to him in 2011 elections. And so I talked to former footballers who played with him, friends. I went to Cameroon, I went to Europe, talked to people who knew him. And I just really wanted to tell a story that will resonate with people. And it's not often we see a former athlete, a former footballer become a president. And I thought the story was intriguing. I thought it was inspirational to a sense. Where it gets tricky is the part of the politics and the presidency. Before he even made up his mind to run for president, there was issues about his unpreparedness for the job and his lack of education. So those things intrigue me. And I wanted this story to be about that, the transition from the footballer to the president. And this is where we are.
Now, of course, you mentioned some of the things that you had to go through in order to get this book written. But what was the main challenge for you as a journalist and as an author to write a book about him without him?
And this was perhaps one of my greatest challenges in my life as a writer, as a journalist. You know, in Africa, it's very unheard of for people to agree to be interviewed about a sitting president. And so there lies my challenge.
Well, this was a gutsy move on your part.
So people are really brave to talk. Some people are really brave to talk. And that's why it's unofficial, because he didn't agree to do the interview. And so I had to find ways to tell a story about this person from where he began. And there I found an old man called Old Man Yaya Kamara. He was someone who actually held George Weah's hand and took him to the first team he played for, Invincible 11, and told the coaches, this is my son. I want him to play on this team. And that's how he began the process of transforming into George Weah. And the old man didn't stop there. He went to next door Guinea, where he found a coach who was out of job called Fernando Sitoli. Sitoli came down to George Weah and said, look, you have the potential to be a Roger Milla or Diego Maradona. And those are the top players of those days. Right. And he said, if you put your mind to it, you can make it. So the book starts from that era where George is struggling to find himself. He had his talent, he was gutsy, he was feared by his opponents in the local domestic leagues, but he wasn't there yet. And so the process of him training, I think it's what made him the footballer he was.
I already see a lot of political metaphors coming out of the sports side of things. But Rodney, you said that you covered him during his years as a soccer player, right, as a football player. What did this book and the research that you did, the interviews you did, what did all those experiences reveal to you about him? Something you didn't know that was very striking, and perhaps that ordinary people don't know about him.
George Weah is probably, let me say, one of the greatest footballer to not go to the World Cup. And Liberia had the opportunity to go to the World Cup in 94, but they were going through civil crisis and stuff like that. And if we had just won a game against Ghana, we would have qualified. But we lost that game. And George actually almost retired from the game because he felt he was insulted. People say he sold the game to Ghana. People say he didn't play his best game. And he retired from international football after that. Although he came back, it showed that there were lots of tension in the background of the team. And most of the players felt that he held grudges against them. He played people who he wanted to play. He played his friends who he had more connection with, and others who didn't have connection with him, he didn't play them. Because he was George Weah, he was like a coach, and he could decide who played on the field. So the book goes into all of those behind the scenes things that happened. I mean, I interviewed his people who were there, so it's very gripping. And the way I wrote this book is like a movie. It's like I wanted people to leave this book saying, I've now understand why George Weah is who he is as president, because of what he was as a footballer. And there were the similar things you're saying as a president, these things were seen those days when he was a great football player.
This is fascinating, but also timely, Rodney, because Liberia will hold elections later this year. Of course, President Weah said that he will run for a second term, but his first term has been dogged by corruption and, of course, involving even people in his own circle, his government officials, his chief of staff. But then there's also the economic downturn. We know, as you said, that he was a great football player, and some would say that football is a contact sport, right? And so is politics often, right? What kind of president has he been?
Well, as you know, George Weah succeeded Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and those are tough shoes to fill. Ironically, Ellen Sirleaf endorsed him for president without endorsing a vice president, Joseph Boyka, who's currently running for president now. It tells you that she felt comfortable with George Weah. Most people criticize her for that because they're saying everything that's happening now in Liberia is because of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, because she endorsed George Weah's candidacy and she ensured that he became president. As a result, what we're seeing now is a lack of governance, a lot of corruption, greed by officials in government. And President Weah has been very defensive of those who were accused of corruption. Late last year, the U.S. placed sanctions on 3 of his officials to send a message that they're not happy with what's going on. And we're hearing there are more sanctions on the way. So all of these things puts it in a different dilemma for him. There have been protests when he first took over. And so all of these things, these entanglements, these different variations of things that happen in the country is because people are not happy.
How many of these qualities that he had as a sportsman have sort of spilled over into politics? Do you see some of those characteristics of George Weah, the footballer, come through in George Weah, the president?
So people always ask me why I picked the title, the footballer president. And sometime last year, he made a speech at a dedication ceremony where he apologized to the Liberian people because he's loved football too much. His presidency has been buoyed by a lot of comparison to football. He's always playing football. If he's not playing football, he's singing reggae music. So people are like, there's all these things happen in the country, People can send their kids to school. People can feed their kids. There's corruption, there's greed, and you're playing football. And he said, I can't help it. This is who I am. This is the man who came from the slums of Gibraltar, where he grew up, from West Point, from Claratown, from Newtown. Those are places that in the process of writing this book, I went to those places. I interviewed people about what they thought about him as president. And many of them were glorified that he was president because he's one of them. The irony is that they're not seeing the results of that love. The love has not been reciprocated because they still live in poverty.
Right.
Most of the conditions that were there when he lived there, when he grew up there, are still there. George Weah is a very lovable guy. With all the things that happen in the country, this should be a slam dunk for the opposition. But because he's George Weah, he's still massively popular among his base.
Right.
So it's tricky. How do you explain to people Liberia's going through this mess, but he may get reelected? So that's the dilemma Liberia finds itself in.
And speaking of that, Rodney, should President Weah be re-elected, what do you think is the one thing that he will need to accomplish for Liberia, for his presidency to have been a success? I mean, what's the one thing that could make or break his legacy?
If he fails to tackle corruption, as he did not do in the first term, if he fails to improve governance, as he did not do in the first term, if he fails to address the issue of poverty, if you drive to Liberia streets nowadays, Monrovia streets, there are young kids who should be in school selling on the street between cars. Those kids should be in school. Women are being raped. Young girls are having fistula because they're being raped and born in children under 12, 11 years old. And this is something that I'm very passionate about in terms of addressing these issues. And so I think if he revisit where he came from, because he's popular, he's like an empire without clothes. You want to hear the things that people tell you around you, but outside that space is where the problem lies. If he can move beyond appointing only his friends in government, people that he knows, and go outside the box to opposition and bring in some people to help him, he could be a very different president the second time if he gets it. The biggest gift Madam Sirleaf had, as the former president had, was she was able to bring opposition figures in the government. The government was kind of inclusive from different parts of the country. George Weah needs to really look at himself, not just where he's from, but outside where he's from, and bring people in, new breed, new blood. If he sticks with the same people, I'm afraid it will be a doomed legacy.
Here's hoping. I'll keep my fingers crossed that your book becomes a movie. Tell me when and if it does. But Rodney Sieh, what a pleasure to have had you here on the show. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us. The title of the book is George Weah, The Story of Africa's Footballer President. Rodney, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.